Hi, I'm Yasmin Alansari, and I'll be going over texturing a game with gradients. So, I'm a 3D generalist, but I kind of do a bit of everything. I've worked on making garbage mobile game edits for a while. None of them are real. They're all made in Unreal Engine. But more importantly, and the reason I'm here is I like making games. So you guys might recognize me from presenting Cardboard Hero a few times at some past meetups, but today I'll be talking about Stroke of Magic, which was a VR game, so virtual reality game that I made back in college over the course of 2 quarters with 6 other team members. So one of the main things when we were making this game was we wanted to make a game that could show off the 3D assets of a lot of our team members, because we were a team of entirely artists and a few people that kind of do a bit of everything. So I kind of took the lead in trying to figure out an art style and direction that would work both, physically for portfolios, but also that would run well on a VR headset. This is also for the Quest 2, so mobile VR. So it's running off of basically a phone. So before I get into it, I want all of you guys to kind of have a guess of how many textures were in those environments you just saw. Just kind of think of it in your head.
0.
Not 0, but 1. All of the assets are all bunched together on a singular texture sheet. And the reason we didn't use 0, I'll answer that in the end actually, but yeah. So, sorry, 1 second, I'm realizing one slide just did not show up in the slideshow. Oh, there we go. Okay, 3D 101, because we're going to be talking about it. What is a model? 3D models. They're made up of vertices, edges, and faces, which are little points, lines, and shapes that make up the model. And you take those parts of the model and you project them onto a UV map. And this is the UV map right here. And that projection allows you to make a texture. And usually you take that UV map and you paint on it, and that painting is projected onto the model. So we already went over that. But our texture sheets look kind of like this. And we've got one for each level. Let's break it down. So we've got an area where we have some strips of blurred colors, blank spot, and a gradient. We use the strips as kind of like our main color palette, and they're blurred together so that we can get some of those in-between colors and blend between them. And blank space, because while we were working on the game, we didn't know everything we wanted to have in it. So if we realized we needed some extra colors that we didn't plan for, we've got the space to put them in. So this is what the UVs look like. This looks kind of terrifying, but don't worry. That's what it's supposed to look like. So I'm going to talk through a quick video. You take your 3D model, you make a camera-based projection of it in the direction that you want the gradient. You scale it up and down, and you'll see that the gradient is going stronger or less strong in the direction that the projection was. Then you want to separate any parts that you want to be a different color and move them to wherever you want on the color sheet. And you'll see I took the stem, and I'm going to rotate the stem so that some of it goes on the light brown, some of it's on the dark brown. The dark brown darker where the shadow is. And then you can even take some of the individual vertices and move them up to an even lighter color. So it's like you're painting with light. So here I'm taking little spots on the apple, and I'm separating them out, and then moving the rest of the mesh so that relatively it'll look like the spots are a lighter color. And now you're just seeing if I move it up, then it would be darker, down, it would be lighter relatively. If I selected all of them together and move them all to a different area, then it's like you're changing the color of the mesh. You can then also scale it, and that will make the gradient less intense or more intense. So that's less intense, and then if you scale it up, it's more intense because it's covering more color variety. And you can take edges, faces, and all that kind of stuff, and move them without completely separating them, and it's like you're painting a more gradual version of that color onto that section. So yeah, that's literally it. It's so fast. So we just covered the workflow. Hand painterly is kind of how I describe it. I like to think of it as taking the 3D model and you're like kind of dipping it in paint in different areas. And using that, you can still fake surfaces like metallic. And if you put things darker or lighter, if you add like a slightly different hue to it, it can give it a bit more color to those fake shadows. And you can kind of think of it as like contouring each of these 3D models like makeup, like trying to exaggerate the shadows and stuff. So benefits, unified color palette. All the objects in your level will be very unified because you've kind of predetermined that color palette, so nothing will really stand out. Level-wide color tweaks, if you realize that part of your color palette is not really working, you can just change the texture and then everything is changed altogether. High resolution, that texture that you saw before that we were texturing our levels with, it was 1024 by 1024, and we literally would scale up these models like 300 times or really small. You could not even tell the difference. Performance, it allowed us to run on a VR headset because I won't get into too technically, but textures and materials are some of the biggest things that really weigh down a game. Small file size, textures are also one of the biggest files that you'll have in a game, so reducing those not only lets levels and stuff load faster, it also makes the file size smaller for both the developers and the people playing. Asset flexibility, you saw how easy it was to UV stuff, so sometimes we found out that if we took an asset and we put it in a different level and changed the texture, it would actually be like completely different in a way that was kind of fun, and we could reuse it in a totally new way. Quick and easy. It made the workflow incredibly quick, so people could focus on making models, and the UVs were relatively easy. Pipeline optimization. It meant that we didn't have to switch softwares. The people that were making the assets, they already had the texture sheet in there. You take your 3D model and just boop, 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 and you've already got your texture. You didn't have to pop into Substance Painter. It's fun, subjective, but I found it incredibly fun to just see the effects right away. Common issues. Light maps. Automatic light maps will not work. Other texture maps. If you want to use other texture maps, you're going to need to use different strategies. So that's like roughness, normals, etc. Poly count. You're going to be relying on your geometry for detail. Your geometry will be higher resolution. Foresight. You've got to plan these texture sheets in advance. So, some solutions. Make custom light maps. This actually ended up being incredibly beneficial for us because that meant we could optimize the light maps even more than we ever did before, and we found out some new strategies using that. Surface detail methods, so you can use materials like world-aligned materials and stuff to add that extra texture that isn't reliant on UVs, or you can use UV channels. Poly count, as long as you're using LODs, that increased poly count doesn't really matter. Foresight, just leave extra room on the texture sheet and know not to change it retroactively and you'll be fine. So, since we have time, super secret light map hacks. Our models, they were stylized, so even straight objects had really weird curves to them. And that meant when we made the light maps originally, we kept those curves in the light map and we got these little jaggy edges in our light maps. So the fix, I like to think of the UVs for our light maps as pixel art. And anything that was tilted on the grid would end up having jagged edges. So we tried to line everything up that would either have a sharp edge or something like that to a pixel grid. So this is the UVs for the shelf after I fixed it. So you can see we left a lot of extra space between the different parts of the shelf. Anywhere that had something like a 90-degree angle or an intense difference between light and dark, we'd separate so that you wouldn't have any bleeding from one end to another. And that actually allowed us to really change up the resolution of the light map, which saved even more texture space, because light maps are like an engine way to bake down like a separate texture for where the lighting is going. So that's basically everything in like a really quick summary of how we did those funky little textures. So if you want to try it out and you happen to have a Quest 2 or 3, you can try it on SideQuest. It hasn't been updated though, so you know, it's whatever we had at the end of college. Thank you. Also shout out to Sky Children of Light, because that's where I found out that this texture technique was even a thing.
Well, wait, they did that?
Oh yeah. They used, that's why originally their capes were so time consuming to make and people had requests for different ones and they were like, no, I'm sorry, we can't do that. Because they needed to add the geometry to those capes to make those patterns.
Oh, God.
Oh, I see some questions in the back, so I'll just, should I?
Take it.
Okay, thanks. So I was also wondering with regards to using texture sets and UDIMs, is that something else you've also looked at but thought, okay, could I maybe do maybe 5 or 6 of those and maybe limit it to that as well as another way of just adding more variety to those gradients?
Yeah, we actually originally considered using an extra UV set for like a masked texture to get more patterns like wood and stuff, but then we ended up finding out it was quicker for us to just model the geometry in. So we haven't really messed with that, but I'm assuming that's kind of what Sky Children of Light does.
Did you do anything with vertex coloring?
Not for this game, but it definitely would be possible.
Did you find there was a learning curve with stuff like the contour and shadows, or did that come pretty naturally in the process?
Honest to God, I found it easier than texturing things normally, because sometimes when you want a gradient on something, and you're texturing it, you end up like texturing it, and the edge has kind of like that cutoff, and you're like, ugh. And with this, it just, the UVs look so whack, but you don't really have to think about them. You just kind of do what looks right. And it's so, I mean, we were working with low poly models, so I'm guessing maybe if you increase the poly count, it starts getting hellish. But for our case, I found it much more intuitive than texturing normally.
I got a question. Does it take a long time to do compared to just regular? Like, how long does it take?
Oh, I mean, you saw that video, that was like live. So that was 130 minutes, and I was leaving extra space and time to kind of demonstrate the concepts. So I could have like textured that apple in less time than it would take for me to open up Substance Painter.
One question. Have you tried any like extensions to this to make it more kind of maybe adding some ornamentation or something like that? Or is it because of stretching like difficult to add?
We messed with masking a little bit, but we didn't end up doing it here. But you could totally do that, where you have a separate UV layer, where you just UV things differently for a texture that's just like masked on top of it. So that's one way to get extra detail. Now, the normal roughness, all that extra stuff, I've seen the game Sky Children of Light. I know it's possible. We just sort of didn't open that can of worms. But it must be possible because they did it.
I have a follow-up question. So did you happen to combine the 3 different textures to get different results, or did you do any of those like permutations at all?
We ended up having so much extra room to do things in our game because we saved so much on performance that we just ended up sometimes using textures from different levels in another one. So yes, actually, and it was kind of fun that sometimes we take an asset from one level and put it in another just to see what happened. It's like, oh, what would the texture look like on this map? Like, just for fun. And most of the time it actually worked out, which was pretty funny. This is the last question.
I was just wondering if you made any use of instancing in Engine to get color variation, or if you were just happy with that the one base color map.
There were no instances used, but what we did was we made a different version of the material for different lighting modes. So we had one version of the material that was unlit that we used on some movable objects, one version of the material that was regular lighting, and then we had one version that was additive.